The sweltering Texas heat had already begun to settle in the small town of Laredo by early May. The streets, usually bustling with the sound of car engines and street vendors, were eerily quiet as if the town was holding its breath. In the sprawling house just outside the city limits, Judge Alan Carter sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. The judge had lived a life full of respect, wealth, and power. At 45, he had everything any man could wish for, except for one thing: the ability to stop the mistakes he was about to make. His marriage to his wife, Rachel, had been struggling for years. Their relationship, once the envy of the town, had become a facade. They had grown apart, but they both refused to admit it. Instead, they had found a quiet agreement, an open marriage, one where both partners could explore other relationships without the risk of betrayal. The arrangement seemed to work for a while, though the cracks were beginning to show. Alan's affair, however, wasn't with just any woman. It was with Caroline Brooks, the 19-year-old daughter of Sheriff Michael Brooks. Caroline had been working as a legal assistant in the courthouse for a few months, and when her path crossed with Alan's, an undeniable chemistry formed. It started innocent enough: long glances across the courtroom, an occasional touch of the hand in passing. But soon their meetings became more frequent. What started as casual flirtation turned into a full-blown affair, hidden behind the judge's power and Caroline's youthful naivety. Caroline had grown up in the shadow of her father, who had served as sheriff for almost 20 years. The Brooks family was well respected in Laredo, a fixture of law and order in the town. Sheriff Brooks, a man of strong principles, was not someone to be trifled with. He prided himself on his integrity, and the idea of his daughter being involved with a married man, let alone the town's judge, would have shattered him. But it wasn't just the affair that would unravel their lives. Caroline, after months of secrecy, realized she was pregnant. And as the days passed, she grew sicker, more withdrawn. Her health seemed to deteriorate rapidly. Caroline knew she needed to see a doctor, but she was too afraid, too ashamed. She had not told her father, nor had she confessed to Alan. Instead, she kept it to herself, hoping the problem would go away. But the truth was catching up with her faster than she could run. The first signs of trouble came when Caroline went to a clinic for an appointment, terrified that she would be found out. The test results shocked her. Caroline had contracted HIV. There was no other explanation. She knew where it came from. Alan, the man she had been seeing behind closed doors, had unknowingly transmitted the virus to her. Caroline didn't know what to do. She loved Alan in her own way, but she couldn't keep the affair secret any longer. She had to tell someone. She thought about telling her father, but the fear of what that would do to their family kept her quiet. Instead, she sought help from a trusted friend, Rachel, Alan's wife. But Rachel, having her own suspicions about her husband's actions, could see the guilt in Caroline's eyes and didn't trust her. As the days passed, Caroline's condition worsened. She felt nauseous, weak, and dizzy all the time. Eventually, Alan began to notice her absence in the courthouse and began to worry. He called Caroline several times but received no answer. By this point, Caroline had gone into hiding, fearing not just for her health, but for the fallout from the affair. And then, one day, she was found dead. It was a quiet Tuesday when Caroline's body was discovered in a nearby alley. She had been murdered, strangled with her own scarf. The town was in shock. Sheriff Brooks was devastated, but what he didn't know was that his own daughter's life had been cut short by the very man who should have been protecting her. The man who held the power to sentence criminals, but could not stop the disaster he had created. The police immediately began their investigation, but Alan, the judge, stayed out of the spotlight. His alibi solid and his reputation intact. No one suspected him. After all, he was a man of the law, an upstanding member of the community. However, deep down, Alan knew that everything he had built was about to collapse. His affair with Caroline, the pregnancy, the HIV, he knew these were secrets that would destroy him if they ever came to light. But someone was watching. Detective Sarah Johnson, a seasoned investigator with the Laredo Police Department, was not a stranger to murder investigations. She had worked dozens of cases, but this one felt different. The young girl had been too innocent, too full of promise to have her life stolen from her in such a brutal way. When Sarah reviewed Caroline's medical records and saw the HIV diagnosis, her mind immediately went to Alan. She had a gut feeling about him, something she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the fact that Caroline had been involved with the judge. It was the way the entire town looked the other way when it came to Alan's secrets. As Sarah dug deeper, she found more troubling details about Caroline's relationship with Alan. She uncovered evidence of Caroline's pregnancy, which she had kept hidden from everyone, including her own father. The pieces of the puzzle started to come together. Caroline had been carrying Alan's child, and when she found out she was infected with HIV, it was too much for her to bear. She had planned to expose the affair, but before she could, someone had silenced her. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear. Caroline had been murdered to keep the affair a secret, but the question remained, who had done it? Detective Sarah Johnson spent the next few days tracking down leads and interviewing witnesses, all while trying to keep her personal emotions in check. The town of Laredo was in turmoil. Sheriff Brooks was devastated by the loss of his daughter. The judge remained untouched by the suspicion surrounding him. In the community, deeply divided, whispered about what had really happened. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Everything about Caroline's death seemed too neat, too convenient. Alan Carter, the respected judge, had his life turned upside down. His name had been in the headlines, and while he maintained his public image, he was slowly starting to unravel behind closed doors. In the days following Caroline's death, Alan found himself on edge. He knew that his affair with Caroline had been kept a secret, until now. The news of her murder would be the least of his worries if the investigation began to tie him to it. And then there was the matter of the HIV diagnosis that could destroy his reputation completely. At the courthouse, Alan kept his distance from the investigation, but his every move was being watched. Detective Sarah Johnson had already begun to uncover small details that made him look suspicious. Caroline had been in his office multiple times, and witnesses recalled seeing her leave just hours before her death. But it wasn't just the affair that raised alarms. Sarah had learned about Alan's health status. There was an HIV diagnosis, and the idea that he could have transmitted it to Caroline, and, by extension, put her life at risk, was enough to make her dig deeper. Sarah was in Alan's office now, going over his records. She knew that Alan had been keeping his medical condition a secret. His file showed no direct proof, but rumors and whispers around the courthouse pointed to it. Sarah had pulled strings and found the truth. Alan was HIV positive. The question was how much Alan had known about his condition, and whether Caroline had been fully aware of the risk she was facing. The small courthouse office smelled faintly of paper and leather as Sarah sifted through more paperwork. It was the quiet before the storm. Alan Carter was a man who thrived on control, but now his life was slipping out of his hands. She knew he was feeling the pressure. His affair had come to light posthumously, but it was only a matter of time before the full truth would emerge. When she walked into Alan's office, he stood up, startled but composed. His suit was perfectly tailored, his hair neatly combed. The man had always prided himself on appearing flawless, especially in front of his colleagues. "Detective Johnson," Alan said, offering a weak smile. "What brings you here today?" "I'm just following up on some questions," Sarah said, leaning against the doorframe. "I wanted to talk about Caroline Brooks, Judge Carter." Alan's expression faltered for a split second. "My condolences go out to Sheriff Brooks and his family. Caroline was a young woman with great potential. Is that all she was to you?" Sarah's voice was even but firm. Alan's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're implying, Detective." Sarah stepped closer, holding up a folder. "You were close to Caroline, weren't you? The two of you had an affair." Alan stiffened, his face losing color for just a moment. He recovered quickly. "That's a baseless accusation. We worked together professionally. That's all." "You're the judge here, Alan," Sarah replied, her tone icy. "I don't have to remind you that we're not in a courtroom. You know better than to lie to me." Alan exhaled slowly. The walls were closing in on him, but he still had time to maneuver. "It's not what you think, Detective. What Caroline and I had was a mistake. It was a lapse in judgment, nothing more." Sarah wasn't convinced. She had already seen the evidence. Caroline's medical records, the affair's timeline, the potential link between Alan's HIV diagnosis and Caroline's. But something else lingered in her mind. The murder. How long was this affair going on, Judge Carter? she asked, her voice growing more pointed. How long did you keep the secret from your wife and from the rest of Laredo? Alan's face reddened slightly. This is a personal matter. You have no right to question my marriage or my private life. I have every right, Sarah replied. You see, this case isn't just about a teenage girl who's gone missing or a murder. It's about the truth. Caroline is dead, and there's only one person who had everything to lose by her silence. The judge's face twisted in frustration, and he took a step closer, trying to maintain his air of authority. You think you know everything, but you don't, and you'll never understand the weight of my decisions. Sarah could see through the bravado. Alan was slipping, but Sarah knew there was still more to uncover. Over the next few days, Sarah continued her investigation into Alan's personal life. She dug deeper into his marriage with Rachel, who had remained tight-lipped about the affair. But Sarah knew that Rachel was no innocent bystander in all of this. She had been suspicious of Alan's behavior for years. Was Rachel part of the cover-up? Had she known about the affair and in some twisted way accepted it? Rachel wasn't one to back down from the truth, and when Sarah eventually tracked her down at their home, Rachel was ready to talk. Detective Johnson, I know what you're going to ask me, Rachel said, her voice thick with tension. And the answer is no. I didn't know about Alan's affair, not until Caroline died. Sarah took a seat. But did you know something was wrong? Rachel sighed heavily. Yes, Alan had changed. He'd become distant, withdrawn, and he was sick. I found his medication one day, and when I looked it up, I realized he had HIV. Sarah's heart sank. And yet you stayed? Rachel's gaze hardened. What choice did I have? Alan is the judge here. He's the man everyone looks up to. And I had my own secrets too. Secrets. The word stuck with Sarah. It felt like the key to everything. The affair, the HIV, Caroline's murder. It all pointed back to secrets people were willing to protect. But at what cost? The days following Rachel Carter's confession were a blur of intense investigation. Detective Sarah Johnson spent hours piecing together what she had learned about Alan's life, his marriage, and his affair with Caroline Brooks. The more she uncovered, the more she began to see the web of lies that Alan had carefully constructed. But as the pieces came together, one thing became clearer than ever. Caroline's murder had been planned, not a crime of passion. Sarah knew that her next step was to bring in the people closest to Alan, the ones who might have witnessed things others hadn't noticed, the ones who might hold the final key to exposing the truth. It was time to confront those who had seen the judge in a different light, the people who worked with him at the courthouse, and the ones who had been involved in his secret life. But before Sarah could dig deeper, another shocking piece of evidence surfaced. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when Sarah received a phone call from Officer Martinez, who had been reviewing surveillance footage from the area where Caroline's body had been found. He'd found something that made Sarah's heart race. There was a blurry figure in the background of the alley, and though the footage was grainy, it looked suspiciously like a man in a dark suit, exactly the kind of suit Alan Carter would wear. Sarah rushed to the police station and stood in front of the grainy footage. Martinez paused it on the figure in question. The man in the video appeared to be carrying something, but it was hard to tell what. Still, Sarah could see the way he walked, his posture, his deliberate movements. The same movements she had seen from Alan when she'd spoken to him in his office. Alan knew how to move with purpose, to avoid suspicion, and that same behavior was evident in the video. How far are we from confirming if it's him? Sarah asked Martinez. I'm working on getting a clearer image from the camera footage down the street, he replied. But this could be the break you're looking for. Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. If Alan was involved in Caroline's murder, it would be the final confirmation of what she had feared. But she couldn't let herself jump to conclusions. She needed more, something solid to tie him directly to the crime. The next day, Sarah went to the courthouse. She had a new lead, and this time, she planned to get answers directly from those closest to Alan. She needed to understand if anyone had noticed anything odd about the judge's behavior before Caroline's death. She first spoke with his clerk, an elderly woman named Margaret, who had worked for Alan for more than 15 years. Margaret was one of the few people who had seen the judge in his most unguarded moments. She wasn't an easy person to crack, but Sarah had a way of getting to the heart of things. "Did you notice anything unusual about the judge lately?" Sarah asked as she sat across from Margaret in her cramped office. Margaret looked up from her desk, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What do you mean by unusual? His behavior, his health, anything that seemed off?" Sarah pressed. Margaret hesitated, but then her face softened. "He'd been quieter than usual. He's always been a man of few words, but lately, he'd been distracted. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window, lost in thought." Sarah leaned in. "Did he say anything about Caroline? Was she still working here after the affair started?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Caroline? Oh yes, she worked with Alan on a few cases. I don't think anyone knew about their relationship. But there were times when I'd see them together, and the way he looked at her." Margaret trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "What do you mean?" Sarah urged. "I don't know. He would smile in a way that seemed possessive. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But now with everything that's happened, I wonder if he saw her as more than just a affair." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think he might have wanted to keep her quiet, Detective." Sarah's instincts told her Margaret had stumbled onto something important. If Alan had wanted to keep Caroline quiet, that would explain why he had gone to such extreme lengths to murder her. Caroline had been a threat, not just because of the affair, but because of the secret she carried that could expose his HIV status. If she told anyone about her condition, about what had happened between them, it would destroy Alan. Later that evening, Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing all the evidence. Caroline's pregnancy, the HIV diagnosis, Alan's affair, the surveillance footage. All the signs pointed to one thing. Alan had orchestrated the murder to protect himself from the fallout. But there was still something missing, something that could connect Alan directly to the crime. As Sarah ran through her notes, she remembered something that had come up in her conversations with Sheriff Brooks. Caroline's mother, a woman named Victoria, had tried to reach Caroline several times the day she died, but Caroline had not answered. Victoria had even sent a text, asking her to come home, worried about how distant she had become. It was then that Sarah had an epiphany. She had been looking at this case from the wrong angle. Caroline had been trying to distance herself from Alan before her death. She had probably planned to go public with the affair, to expose Alan and his secrets. That meant Caroline's murder wasn't just about her pregnancy or HIV. It was about power. Alan had to eliminate her before she could destroy him. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Sarah received the results from the lab. The scarf used to strangle Caroline had been tested for DNA. It didn't match Caroline's or anyone else's in the town. But when they tested it against Alan's DNA, it came back positive. There was no denying it now. The days that followed were a blur for Detective Sarah Johnson. The truth had finally emerged, but the weight of the revelation settled heavily on her shoulders. Alan Carter, the respected judge who had built his career on integrity and justice, was the very man who had orchestrated the murder of a young woman to protect his secrets. He was no longer just a suspect. He was the murderer. Sarah spent the next few days reviewing the case one last time, ensuring every detail was in place. The DNA evidence, the witness testimonies, Caroline's medical records, and the surveillance footage. It was all there. Alan's guilt was undeniable. But Sarah knew that securing an arrest would be the easy part. What came next would be the true challenge, bringing a man of Alan's power and influence to justice. It was a cold Tuesday afternoon when Sarah met with the district attorney, Henry Adams, to go over the final details of the case. Henry had been one of the few people who had believed in her from the start. He trusted her instincts, and that trust had been validated. "Sarah," Henry began, "this case is solid. We have the DNA, the motive, the affair, everything. But you and I both know that taking down someone like Alan Carter won't be easy. He has friends everywhere, connections in the courthouse, in the police department, and in every corner of this town." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "But it's not just about who he knows. It's about what he's done. He murdered Caroline Brooks to protect his own life, his reputation, and his dirty little secret. That's what matters, Henry sighed. I agree, but we have to be prepared for the fight of our lives. If he has even the smallest opportunity, Alan will use every tactic he can to get out of this. He's a master manipulator. Sarah nodded. I've seen it in his eyes. He thinks he can talk his way out of anything. But this time, there's no way out. Later that afternoon, Sarah stood outside the courthouse. The towering building loomed over her, its imposing structure a symbol of the power and control that Alan Carter had wielded for so many years. But now, it was the place where his reign would end. Sarah knew the press would be there in full force. The murder of Caroline Brooks had captivated the town, and the truth about Alan Carter's involvement would shake the very foundation of Laredo. Sarah had prepared herself for the backlash, for the outcry that would come from those who couldn't believe their beloved judge could commit such an atrocity. Inside Alan's office was eerily quiet. Alan had been expecting this moment, but that didn't mean he was ready for it. He had spent the last few days trying to cover his tracks, but it was too late. The walls were closing in. He had been silent, too quiet, something he rarely was. His lawyer had advised him to lay low, but Alan's arrogance would be his downfall. When Sarah walked into his office, she saw him sitting behind his desk, his face pale, his hands trembling ever so slightly. But his posture remained rigid, controlled. The man who had once held the power to control the lives of others now found himself trapped. Judge Carter, Sarah said, her voice low but resolute, you're under arrest for the murder of Caroline Brooks. Alan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at his desk, his fingers slowly tapping on the wood. For a moment, he appeared to be weighing his options, calculating his next move. You don't have the evidence, detective, Alan said, his voice cold. You have nothing. You think this is over, but it's not. You don't know what you're up against. Sarah met his gaze head on. I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you did. Alan stood up suddenly, his face flushed with rage. You think you can just walk in here and destroy my life? You have no idea what you're dealing with. I've been on the bench for years. I've sentenced people like you to prison. You think I'm going to fall because of one little mistake? Sarah remained calm. It's not a mistake, Judge. It's murder. And now you'll answer for it. As Sarah escorted Alan out of his office, the courthouse fell silent. The guards, the clerks, even the attorneys in the hall, all of them stood frozen as Alan was led away in handcuffs. The sight of the once respected judge, now reduced to a criminal, sent shockwaves through the building. Outside, the media was waiting. The cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions, eager for the story of the century. Alan Carter, the man who had upheld the law for so long, was now the very man accused of breaking it. Alan's lawyer arrived just as Sarah placed him into the back of a squad car. You're making a huge mistake, the lawyer shouted. We'll have this thrown out in court. You don't have anything. Sarah ignored him, her focus entirely on Alan. She could see the anger in his eyes, the fear creeping in beneath the mask of defiance. But she knew that no matter how much he fought, it was over. The truth had come to light, and Alan would no longer be able to hide behind his power and influence. Back at the station, Sarah sat at her desk, going over the case one final time. Alan was locked in a holding cell, his fate now in the hands of the legal system. She had done everything she could. The rest was up to the courts. As she sat in silence, Sarah thought about Caroline Brooks, the young woman whose life had been cut short by a man who had taken everything from her. She had been a victim of a cruel and dangerous lie, one that only a man like Alan Carter could perpetuate. But Sarah had made sure the truth had come to light. And while it wasn't enough to bring Carolyn back, it was enough to make sure Alan would never harm anyone again. The courthouse was buzzing with tension. It wasn't just the usual murmur of legal proceedings or the rustling of papers. This time, it was different. This time, the entire town was waiting for the trial of the century, the trial of Judge Alan Carter, the respected man who had been brought low by his own dark secrets. It had been 2 weeks since Alan's arrest. Since then, the media frenzy had only intensified. Alan's life was on display for the entire town to see. His picture had been plastered on every news outlet, his face a mix of defiance and fear. In the months following his arrest, every detail of the affair, the HIV diagnosis, the murder of Caroline Brooks, Everything had come to light. The scandal had become the main topic of conversation in Laredo, with everyone speculating about how far Alan would go to save himself. But Sarah knew that no matter what Alan did, the truth was on her side. The DNA evidence, the witnesses, the motive, all of it pointed to him. There was no escaping it. Still, she couldn't help but wonder, would Alan fight for his life until the very end, using his connections and influence to try to turn the case in his favor? Or would he finally admit to the crime and face the consequences of his actions? The morning of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled to capacity. Every seat was taken, every corner crowded with spectators. Alan's supporters, those who still believed in his innocence, filled one side, while the other side was occupied by the families and friends of Caroline Brooks. Alan's defense team had been preparing for this day for weeks. They had built their case arguing that there was no definitive proof that Alan had killed Caroline. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Henry Adams, had a mountain of evidence: DNA, witness statements, Alan's medical records, and the overwhelming motive, the affair, the pregnancy, the HIV. But as the trial began, it quickly became apparent that the defense had one strategy they would rely on: doubt. They would question the validity of the evidence, suggesting that it was circumstantial at best. They would attempt to paint Caroline as a troubled young woman, implying that she had been involved in something dangerous and had gotten herself killed by someone else. For Alan, it was his last chance to escape conviction. But Sarah knew it was a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down on him. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no hiding from the reality of what he had done. As the trial wore on, Sarah sat in the courtroom, her eyes never leaving Alan. His calm demeanor hadn't changed. He still wore the same tailored suits, still carried himself with the same air of superiority. But Sarah saw the cracks beneath the surface. She saw the way he fidgeted when he thought no one was looking, the way his eyes darted around when the evidence grew more damning. It was during cross-examination that Sarah had her breakthrough moment. Caroline's best friend, Jennifer Green, had been called to the stand. She had known Caroline since childhood and was the only one who had seen the toll the affair had taken on her. Jennifer recounted the last few conversations she'd had with Caroline, including one where Caroline had confided in her about the affair with Alan and her fear of what might happen if she became pregnant. Jennifer told the court how Caroline had been afraid of the consequences, especially if her father found out. Caroline was scared, Jennifer said, her voice breaking as she relived the painful memories. She didn't want anyone to know, but she said if anyone found out, her whole world would come crashing down, and she couldn't live with that. As Jennifer spoke, Sarah watched Alan's face. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah could see the tension in his clenched jaw. This wasn't just a murder trial for Alan. It was the trial of his entire life. His reputation was at stake. His legacy as a judge, the power he had held over the lives of others, was crumbling. Alan Carter wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for everything he had built. The closing arguments were a flurry of emotion. The defense painted Alan as a man who had been caught in a moment of weakness, a man who had made mistakes but wasn't capable of murder. They tried to manipulate the facts to distort the truth, but Henry Adams stood firm. Judge Alan Carter was not a man driven by a moment of passion, Henry said, his voice steady but full of conviction. He was a man driven by fear, fear of losing everything he had worked for, fear that the truth about his affair, his HIV, and his crimes would destroy him. And so in his desperation, he killed a young woman, Caroline Brooks, who threatened to expose everything. Henry turned to the jury. This is not just a case of murder. This is a case of a man willing to go to any length to protect himself, no matter the cost. Caroline Brooks didn't just die, she was silenced. And Alan Carter is the one who did it. The room fell silent. For Sari, it was almost over. The trial had been long and draining, but the end was in sight. Now all she had to do was wait. The jury deliberated for hours. The pressure weighed heavily on Sarah's shoulders. It was hard to shake the nagging feeling that Alan still had one last trick up his sleeve. He had been a master of manipulation for so long. But as the jury returned to the courtroom, Sarah felt a quiet hope bloom in her chest. The moment of truth had arrived. "Will the jury please rise?" the judge asked. The foreman stood holding the verdict in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Alan Carter, guilty of the murder of Caroline Brooks. The words rang out, clear and final. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a brief sigh of relief. It was done. Alan's face drained of color. His body sagged as the reality of his defeat hit him. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some of triumph, others of disbelief. Sarah stood still, watching as the man who had once held so much power in this town was led away in handcuffs. The judge who had sentenced countless others was now the one who would pay the price for his own crimes. Outside the courthouse, the crowd gathered. Reporters shouted questions at Sarah, but she remained focused, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Alan Carter had been convicted. Justice had been served. But there was still one thing that haunted her: the memory of Caroline Brooks, the young woman whose life had been taken. It was a small comfort, but at least now, Caroline's story would be told, and the man who had taken everything from her would never harm anyone again. The days following Alan Carter's conviction were a blur of activity. The town of Laredo, still reeling from the shock of the trial, now faced the aftermath of the scandal that had gripped their community for months. For Sarah, the work didn't stop once the verdict was read. There were reports to file, press statements to make, and the final legal proceedings to oversee. But amidst the rush of responsibilities, there was an underlying sense of relief. The man who had manipulated and destroyed lives had finally been held accountable. But the victory felt hollow. Sarah sat at her desk in the dimly lit office, flipping through the case files one last time. The details of the case were etched in her mind. Caroline's fear, Alan's lies, the twisted web that had led to murder. It all seemed so senseless, so tragic. Caroline had been a victim, not just of a man's lust and power, but of a system that had allowed him to hide his darkest secrets for so long. And now she was gone. The phone on Sarah's desk rang, breaking her reverie. She picked it up without looking at the caller ID. "Detective Johnson," she answered. "Sarah," came the familiar voice of District Attorney Henry Adams. "I've been meaning to check in with you. How are you holding up after all this?" Sarah paused for a moment. She hadn't really had the chance to reflect on everything. "I'm fine," she said, her voice betraying none of the exhaustion she felt. "The trial's over. Alan's been convicted. It's over." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "I know it's been tough, but you did a damn good job. You brought the truth to light. That's what matters." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice softening, "but it doesn't change what happened. Caroline's gone, and I keep thinking, could I have done something sooner?" Henry's tone was firm. "You did everything right. You followed the evidence. That's all any of us could do." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. The case had been solved, yes, but the emotional toll, the loss, the devastation would linger long after the headlines faded. Days turned into weeks, and the city slowly began to return to normal. Alan Carter's name was no longer at the forefront of conversations, replaced by new scandals, new crimes. But Sarah found it hard to move on, even as the world around her seemed to forget. One afternoon, Sarah drove out to Caroline Brooks' gravesite. It had been weeks since the trial, but she hadn't been able to visit until now. The air was thick with the scent of fresh earth, and the quiet of the cemetery seemed to echo the silence she felt inside. Caroline's grave was simple. No grand marker, just a small stone with her name, birth and death dates, and the words, "Gone too soon." Sarah knelt in front of the grave, her hands resting on the cold stone. "I did everything I could, Caroline," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I promised I'd bring justice, and I did, but it doesn't feel like enough." For a moment she sat there in the stillness, the weight of the case, the weight of Caroline's death heavy on her heart. There were no more answers to be found, no more secrets to uncover. The case had been closed, and yet the emptiness remained. As she stood up to leave, Sarah noticed a figure standing off in the distance. It was Sheriff Michael Brooks, Caroline's father. His face was etched with grief, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. He had been through hell. His daughter's death had shattered him, and yet he had never wavered in his support for the truth. Sarah approached him cautiously, unsure of what to say. She had spoken to him briefly during the investigation, but this was the first time they were meeting face-to-face since the trial. "Sheriff," Sarah said softly, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I come often," Sheriff Brooks replied, his voice gruff. "I don't know why, but I guess it's the only place left where I can feel close to her." Sarah nodded. "I understand." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I don't know what you did to bring this man down, but you did it, and I'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Sarah swallowed hard. "I just did my job. It was the evidence, not me. You lost your daughter, Sheriff. I can't undo that." "No," he said quietly. "You can't. But you gave us something we didn't have before. Justice. That's more than most people get." His words were simple, but they hit Sarah harder than she expected. She had spent so much time focusing on the case, on solving the crime, that she had almost forgotten what it all meant. Justice wasn't about victory or closure. It was about giving the victims and their families a chance to heal, a chance to remember what they lost, and to ensure that the person responsible for that loss would never hurt anyone again. As Sarah drove back to the station, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift, just a little. The case wasn't over in the way she had hoped, but it was over in the way it had to be. Alan Carter was locked away, and Caroline's death had been avenged. But even as Sarah returned to the mundane tasks of her job, she knew that the lesson she had learned was far more important than any case she would ever solve. Justice was about more than finding the truth. It was about making sure it mattered. And for Caroline Brooks, it mattered. Months had passed since the trial, and Laredo was beginning to heal. The daily chatter about Judge Alan Carter and his crimes had faded into the background of life in the small town. The case was officially closed, the convicted judge now serving his sentence behind prison bars. Yet for Detective Sarah Johnson, the echoes of the case would never fully dissipate. She had done her job. She had exposed the truth. But sometimes the truth wasn't enough to heal the wounds left behind. Caroline's family would forever feel the sting of their loss, and Sarah, despite the victory, felt the quiet, gnawing emptiness that came with it. It was a crisp morning in late October when Sarah received a letter. She had been sitting at her desk, absent-mindedly staring at the stack of case files that seemed to never end, when the thick envelope landed on her desk. No return address, just her name written in a neat, unfamiliar script. She hesitated for only a moment before tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was elegant, almost too perfect. "Dear Detective Johnson, I wanted to take a moment to personally thank you for all you've done. I know the journey has been hard, and I'm sure it's left its scars on you. You may never know how much your efforts have meant to my family and me. The truth has been painful, but it was necessary. Caroline's memory will live on, and the justice you brought will ensure her death was not in vain. Thank you for everything. With respect, Sheriff Michael Brooks." Sarah's fingers lingered on the page as she read the words again. It wasn't the kind of letter she had expected, nor was it something she ever thought she would receive. But in that moment, as the words of gratitude and respect washed over her, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Sheriff Brooks hadn't just thanked her for solving the case. He had acknowledged the toll it had taken on her, on all of them. The scars would remain, yes, but they didn't have to define them. His letter was a reminder that, despite everything, justice had been served, not just for Caroline, but for all the lives affected by her death. Sarah stood up from her desk, looking out the window at the familiar, quiet streets of Laredo. The world outside had returned to its usual rhythm, as it always did after a tragedy. But Sarah knew she wouldn't be the same. She had learned things about herself, about her capacity for resilience and her determination to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might be. And as she read the letter one final time, she realized something important. While justice had been achieved, it didn't mean the end of the story. The story was still being written. There were still people living in the aftermath of the crime, still people who needed to heal. There were still lives to be lived. Sheriff Brooks had been right. Caroline's memory would live on, and Sarah, in her own way, would carry that memory forward. The fight for justice wasn't just about the cases she closed or the criminals she put behind bars. It was about ensuring that the stories of the victims weren't forgotten. Later that afternoon, Sarah made her way to the cemetery. She hadn't visited Caroline's grave in weeks, and she needed the quiet to clear her mind. As she walked through the rows of graves, the soft crunch of the fallen leaves beneath her boots, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean, but it was the best she could offer. When she reached Caroline's resting place, Sarah knelt and placed a small bouquet of flowers on the grave. She whispered a simple prayer, a wish for peace, for healing, for the family who had been left behind. "I won't forget you, Caroline," she said softly. "I promise." As Sarah stood and looked down at the grave, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The case had been long and painful, but she had done what she could. Caroline's story was no longer a secret, it had been told, and now Sarah could finally begin to move on. The journey wasn't over for her. She would continue to fight for the victims, continue to search for the truth, continue to bring justice to the ones who had been wronged. But for today, in this quiet moment, she allowed herself to feel the peace that came with knowing she had done her best.